Welcome friends to the series which we are doing on issues in world history, the 20th century, and in the earlier lecture on the world depression we talked about how this kind of a world economic crisis emerged in 1929. We also talked about some kind of an impact on the industrialized and the semi-colonial world. We tried to compare the European economies of that particular period, how Britain, Germany, how they got affected because of the world economic crisis, the kind of changes which came in the world at that point of time, and we also see that how the rise of USA after the First World War and how this kind of a crisis which emerged in US also created some kind of an impact not only in USA but in other parts of the world. And we talked about the kind of deflationary situation, the kind of depression which came in these countries, and because of which we find that various kind of indicators which have been given by the various scholars. And when we talk about its impact, then we find that in terms of statistics, we talked about the various kinds of figures in the last lecture as well, and how these figures they try to convey the story of the world depression. We also talked about the issue of unemployment, which was rampant at that point of time, and how unemployment was an important indicator in the kind of slump which we saw during this particular period in terms of the employment figures, which was an important concern, and how unemployment was also related to the issue of the falling standard of living as well. And we also talked about the wholesale price indices in 1932 in the last lecture, and how various countries of the world, and we find that UK shows in a way that how wholesale price indices in 1932 they were far higher than other countries, and British figure was higher due to the effect of abandoning the gold standard in September 1931, but still appreciably less than 100. And the other figures and the events they can be cited, but above figures do convey the depth of the slump as well. And how we see that how when you talk about depression and how British in a way reacted to this depression, we see that depression was comparatively milder in that sense when you see the other countries, and it was also because of the decision of the forced and taken with the great distaste to leave the gold standard in September 1931. And we find that, as earlier also we talked about, that how the orthodox elements they were important in the British economy, and how not much was being done to encourage the activity in the economic sphere. And so in that sense Britain was able to escape the worst, but it lost the chance to do better as well. And when you talk about the kind of events they were leading to departure from the gold standard during this time, and we also see that how the slump from 1929 onwards affected the trade, and this in turn reduced the cushion in British balance of payment invisibles. And we find that when you see the situation from 1929 to 1931, the earnings from the invisibles they reduced by 180 million pounds, and it was also this in a way produced a negative balance of trade. The exports they suffered by volume index falling from 104 to 69, and but with the primary prices falling, net barter terms of trade moved in Britain's favor, and thus exports by value fell by a lesser amount. So we find that how the economic situation was unfolding in Britain, and Britain, though it was having the negative balance of trade, we find that there was some kind of changes which were happening. All of this was not reflecting very well on the British economy, and when you will have the adverse balance of trade, it was also very natural that there will be general loss of confidence in the British economy, and how the foreigners they recalled their assets was an important concern during this time. And we also see that how this resulted in an abnormal loss of gold for the Bank of England as well, and all this in a way led to a situation where we find that the pressure on the pound increased in mid 1931. So when the pressure on the pound it increased, naturally the economics or the economic situation had to be in a way salvaged to some point, and the economics theorists and the people, those who were associated with the economic policies in Britain, they also made an effort to come out of this kind of a situation. And we see that how during this time the bank, it refused to increase the interest rate to punitive levels, fearing correctly that the consequences would be appalling in an already depressed economy. So we find that the interest rates, they were not being increased, and we also see that in Britain, French and the American credits, they were spent in the defense of pound. So how they wanted to keep the situation of pound that way, that pound is at a high rate, and they wanted to defend it, and the kind of money which was being borrowed from France and America, it was being used in the defense of pound by Britain. So such kind of policies, such kind of measures, they were being taken by the British economy at this point of time. And we also see that how the government of that particular time, it in a way dampened the fiscal contraction by refusing to cut the unemployment benefits. And we find that the measures for sustaining the value of the pound would have been nothing short of being draconian at that point of time. So when we tend to understand or analyze the British economy, we find that British policy was unprepared to go to the extent of the Chancellor of Germany, Brüning, whose deflation was nothing short of being ruthless. And so we find that there was no choice but to abandon the gold standard, which was being done by Britain in 1931. And when you see how the situation unfolded after that, the kind of changes which came after that, we find that how the devaluation following this agile policy shift was beneficial to the British economy, and how it in a way lowered the British export prices relative to the foreign prices, and allowed the option of a more permissive monetary policy, which was taken up after a half-year delay. So these kind of changes, they came in the economy at this point of time, and because of which we find that imports, they became dearer, and we find that the devaluation checked the fall of the prices in Britain, while they continued to fall in countries still on the gold. And when you have the lower export prices related to foreign prices, it helped also maintain the exports as well. So when we find that on the prices on which export is being done, they are lower than the exports, they were also being maintained. Then when you talk about the share of Britain in the world exports, it increased between 1931 and 1933. So we find that British economy in a way was in a comparatively safer place in terms of exports, when you see that exports, they increased during this particular period. And if you see the kind of changes in the exports, imports, and the balance of trade, we find between 1931 and 1933, if you see the figures which are being given, this in a way tries to show the kind of balance of trade during this time. And if you see the 1931 situation, and if you see the 1933 situation, we find that how imports in Britain, they have decreased during this time, and there is some kind of a marginal increase in the exports. And even in the framework of the balance of trade, we find that Britain had comparatively a higher hand in this, where we find that they are able to in a way bring the balance of trade to a comparatively favorable situation for themselves. And when you see the kind of changes of the British devaluation on a world which was caught in the throes of depression, it was not particularly beneficial. If gold had flowed out of Britain, we find that allowing the other countries to undertake the monetary expansion the impact of the relative price change of those countries could have been mitigated. And if you see the situation the way it happened, that the Bank of England took this opportunity to build up its gold reserves. So we find that the theorists or the economists, those who were trying to in a way communicate their ideas during this time, and so they were in a way able to assess the situation and how the people, those who were responsible for the economy, they also responded. And when you talk about gold, we find that nothing, not even the inflexible minds of the 1920s and the 1930s policymakers could ignore the pressures created by the depression during this time. And when US came out of the gold standard in 1933, and how in 1936 French, they followed suit as well. So we find that the major economies, Britain and thereafter USA and then France, all of them they came out of the gold standard during this time. And many other countries of the world, they were also not very far behind, and most of the policymakers, they did not like it, but they had little choice by then, because the practical considerations at that point of time forced these countries to come out of the gold standard. And so in this way they had created and nurtured the depression, how depression gobbled up their article of faith. The gold standard could be seen during this particular crisis. And we find that when you see that how the various countries of the world, they abandoned the gold standard, and effect of this all round abandonment on Britain was to offset the gains she had made between 1931-33, when she was the sole devaluing country. And the British share of the world exports, which had gone up to 10.37 in 1933, declined to 9.8 in 1937, because we find that the other economies of the world, now they had also increased their exports, and how they had also done away with the gold standard, because of which we find that their situation also improved. And when you tend to see the colonial system in Britain, how the colonial economies, in that sense, how the mother country Britain was able to in a way exploit the situation in the colonial economies, and how they were providing a lot of sources to the British economy. And we also see that there was a dynamism during the early years of British industrialization, and how this also came to the partial rescue of the mother country, which was Britain. And we find that how this kind of a system, which was devised in a way in an appropriate manner, and without a trace of irony as well, it was termed as imperial preferences. And when you talk about them, we find that in 1932 countries of the Commonwealth, they met at Ottawa in Canada, and they in a way agreed to extend to each other the increased import preferences to the British goods. And agreement were also worked out with the smaller countries dependent on the British market, so that they would increase the import from Britain. So we find that this kind of an idea of imperial preferences, where the countries they had to give some kind of preference to Britain in terms of making imports, and it was also in a way named as imperial preferences. So there was an important indicator in that sense, that how British they were able to send their products to other countries of the world in the garb of the imperial preferences. So we find that British, they were in a way they did not have any kind of a shame in that sense, that they brought this kind of a policy. They were in a way they were forcing their colonies to take a lot of goods from them. And we find that how when you talk about these kinds of agreements which were being done for the benefit of the British, and they brought about a lot of change in the British trade, where we find that British, they were able to in a way increase their exports to all these countries. And when you in a way try to compare it within the framework where we find that how the various countries of the world they in a way responded to the kind of changes which were coming in the economies of the world. And we find that how Britain was able to in a way increase its share of the trade in various countries. And when one is talking about this kind of a situation where Britain was able to increase its trade from both the countries which were the countries which belonged to the empire, which were the countries which were occupied by Britain, and the other countries with which it entered into various kinds of agreements. And we find that one loss from this elaborate system of protection was that Britain did relatively poorly in the unprotected markets. And we also see that how the foreign competition was reflected in these markets, further worsening the British performance, which had already started lagging. And this kind of loss in the unprotected markets was enough to outweigh the gain from the protected ones, and British share of world trade it declined during this point of time. We also see that how Britain relative stagnation from 1932 to 1939, and we talked about that how Britain did not suffer as grievously as other industrial countries did. So in that sense Britain lost some kind of chances, and we also see that she did not recover as well as some of the other countries of the world did. For example, USA and Germany, they were able to recover in a far better manner when you compare it with Britain. So we find that this kind of stagnation which took place in the British economy, it continued and it was not able to recover in the way that the other countries of the world they recovered. And we find that it was also because of the fact that the government was vacillating and it was not in a way expanding itself in terms of the economy. And we find that there was some support for the special areas, which are the euphemism for the areas particularly hard hit by depression, and the unemployment dole was increased as well. But we find that the political support for the further changes in the fiscal and the monetary policy was not forthcoming in Britain, and how they were following the conservative fiscal and the monetary policies. And when the Bank of England it raised the rate of interest, partly to replenish the reserves and partly to fight inflation. Prices, however, were nowhere near alarming levels in Britain at that point of time. So we find that the trust of the government policy was, as Hortry put it, to cry fire, fire in Noah's flood. So some increase in economic activity was possible as world output and trade recovered, led by expansionary regime in Germany and US. So we find that when you talk about the economic activity and how this economic activity saw some kind of an increase in terms of the world output, when we see that how USA and Germany they recovered, and how trade also recovered during this time, when you see that both these economies of the world, USA as well as Germany, they were able to in a way recover themselves. And when you talk about this kind of an external stimulus which was joined by a housing boom of the respectable dimensions, partly this was because of a difference in interest rates between the consols and mortgages, which meant that funds flowed into the building society or building activity. And we also find that when you talk about the other factors, then we find that it was also because of the fact that how the creating of the rate differential, and how was that the Bank of England finally exercised the option of pursuing an easy monetary policy which helped the lower interest rates. And because of this we find that the construction and its allied activities or industries, they accounted for 30% of change in income between 1932 and 1937. And as I told you earlier as well, when we were discussing that how the fiscal policy continued to be influenced by the tenets of orthodox public finance, and two other rather ineffective public interventions were made in this period to boost the stagnating industries. And when you talk about the individual industries, we find that many of them, they were hard hit, coal, cotton, iron, steel and shipbuilding, and a number of efforts they were being made to maintain the rates of profit by supporting the monopolistic arrangements during this time. And when you see individual industries, we find that new investments they were also being made, but we find that the arrangements prevented emergence of new and efficient firms during this time, because we find that the policy was to protect the markets by quotas for everybody irrespective of their efficiency. So, the focus was in the framework of, in a way, protecting the quotas, and we also see that this kind of a policy also made the declining industries more inefficient when they were being protected than they otherwise would have been, and restricted the investment in them as well, because when they were not competitive that way. And another policy was in the framework of the tariff protection for both the industry as well as agriculture, but the levels were too low to stop unemployment from declining in the protected sectors. And we find that when you talk about Britain in that sense, how when we see the situation in 1939, and when the first World War ended in 1918, and the Second World started in 1939. So, there was a gap of around 2 decades between these two great wars, and we find that how the economies of the world, they also changed during this particular period, and we will look at these kind of changes which happened in the various economies. And when you talk about the industries like cotton, iron, coal and shipbuilding, they were also hard hit, and they also lost their primary position in the economy. And these economies largely were export oriented, and as exports in this period were adversely affected by a number of factors. So, we find that this kind of a situation, this kind of an international situation forced many countries to turn inwards, because they were not able to export much, and we find that many economies of the world, they also learned this kind of a lesson, that that the home markets can be an important source of growth as well, though it was not being implemented fully during this time. But we realized that how the industries which were in a way focusing on the home markets, they did better in this period than the export oriented ones. And we see that industries like automobiles, metal products and various consumer goods, they also expanded during this time, because many of them, they were also focusing on their internal markets, because they realized that the exports were not happening at that point of time. And we also see many of the new industries were also technologically complex and geared towards mass production, and which in a way helped to turn to the home market. And some of the moves in the technologically advanced industries like aircraft and electrical products, they also relied on the government backing for their growth. So, apart from the focus on the internal markets, we also find that some of the industries which needed some kind of a backup from the government, because it needed a huge capital. So, this kind of a thing was also could also be seen during this time. So, the voodoo economics of the 19th century, which said that the wages of workers must be minimum to promote expansion, was unlearned in this particular era. So, we find that the wages also increased during this time, and we also find that how apart from the export market, the home market was also very important, and we find that the higher wages, they were also recognized as a source of mass demand as well, because when the wages will be high and people, they will get their dues, or for that matter higher wages, then they are going to spend those wages in the home markets only, and this will also bring about more purchasing power, and more products they will be purchased from the markets. So, we find that there was change in the industrial patterns and how in terms of sectoral importance, technology and market orientation during this time. And we also see that how there was increasing concentration during this time, where we see that if you see the situation till 1914, Britain was one of the least concentrated economies, where the small family firms were still dominating the businesses, barring some cases like public utilities and heavy industries. But we find that the kind of changes which came in the economy during this time, whether in the framework of war, slump and the government encouragement, it helped to increase the economic concentration markedly during this time. And before 1914 there were few monopoly products, but by 1935 at least 170 products were mainly produced by the industries comprising less than 4 firms. So, we find that such kind of changes they also came in the industries during this time, and how we find that the number of companies also they in a way when you see them in the framework of how 130 railway companies in 1914, now there were 4 in 1921. So, this kind of a concentration was also happening, and we find that this kind of a concentration was also the outcome of the idea of maintaining profit by eliminating the competition which could have been there. And because of such kind of policies, we find that how it was the result was restrictive and protective, but it was not efficient. And when you see the export sectors in the domestic front too, British industry was no longer competitive in that sense, and British industry also failed to regain the technological leadership which he had started to lose since the 1880s. And it was also because of the fact that how the other countries of the world in terms of technology, Germany for example, or USA, Japan, etc., all of them they were also making some kind of a mark in that sense to in a way increase their technological output. And we also see that the reasons could have been many, and one of them was that how systematic kind of research was not being undertaken in the framework of the development as well. And we find that how the various discoveries or inventions they were not being turned into commercial practicability during this time. So, we will talk about economic depression in the future lecture as well. We will talk about some other dimensions and the aspects of this world phenomena impacting not only European and American economies, but of the other economies of the world. Thank you very much.